Is it working? I think it is. I can hear something.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Sound fine.
Excellent. Okay, now I can't hear you super well, so
Oh, whoops. Okay.
sorry about all the technical difficulties. I need to get you on here. Okay, how about now?
I hear you just fine. Do I sound okay?
Yeah, okay. Now we got to figure it out.
Cool. Well,
How are
Ruben,
you,
this
man?
is I'm very well. It's a treat to meet an Anabaptist who is considering orthodoxy. Or have you already become a catechumen in the Orthodox Church?
I have not become a catechumen. I'm not going to do that for a while. If I do it, I'm taking my time here doing my research.
Good. That's very wise. We have to. I've taken my time. And so have my brothers. I've known Nolan, who you've seen on the channel. I've known him for 9 years, and I've been reading the Fathers really intensely for about 10 years, since I was 18, almost 19, and I'm almost 29 now. And I
Yeah,
was, oh, go ahead.
you started with Berceau, right?
I actually didn't even start reading David Berceau until, I don't know. I mean, there's not much to read from Berceau except his dictionary. My
Sure.
dad actually read his My dad had started reading his dictionary along with the Ante-Nicene Fathers many years before I was born. My dad is very old. He's 72, and
Wow.
he bought Berceau's dictionary in the 90s, and before that he was reading them because he actually learned about the Church Fathers when he went to seminary, and he found it very interesting. He thought, oh, these guys are really great. But his seminary professor said, yeah, but they're heretics. You know, they got a lot of stuff wrong. And my dad was shocked at that, and so he started reading them intensely. And he ended up not becoming a Protestant pastor after all. But
Mhm.
he had a lot of kids. He had me. I'm the fourth of his 9 kids, and he
Wow.
always taught us the church fathers. He'd read the scriptures intensely with us. He told us all the Protestant churches are heretical. He'd have very vigorous Bible study sessions where he would be reading the scriptures and the early church fathers to us, just the Ante-Nicene Fathers. And
Huh.
and so he teaches, faith alone by grace alone is a heresy, eternal security is a heresy. He teaches us the importance of the sacraments and their full meaning from the fathers. He teaches about
Wow.
the Trinity and free will. He teaches against all the heresies about that deny free will. Yeah, he was very intense with it, and most of my siblings have fallen away. They're not interested anymore. But I was very interested, and one other, my younger brother, was also very serious about it. At least, we played video games and stuff like that too. So we were still a worldly family. But then when my parents were getting a divorce when I was almost 19, that was when I said, well, I'm going to own the faith for myself. I'm actually going to seriously read the fathers, and I knew it was true. But there was one thing that I was interested in, and it was that my dad had never taken us to the Orthodox or the Catholic churches. He had really focused on showing us the heresies of the Protestant churches, but he almost never spoke about the Catholics or the Orthodox. And there was one time when I was 17, I had a friend who was joining the Orthodox Church, and I hardly knew anything about it, but I knew a few things. And so I went and spoke to his priest with him when I was 17. I spoke to the priest and the deacon in McKinney, Texas. And I questioned him and I tried to poke holes in the things he believed. And the priest was very calm, and he I don't think he was very combative. I think his deacon was far more combative. But I would say, having, so many years going by, 12 years after that event where I spoke to that Orthodox priest, I've investigated it more seriously. And all of us, my brothers who've been reading the Fathers with us for years, we had all decided that if the Orthodox Church really was the true church, or if the Catholic Church was the true church, we would join it. We saw that
Mhm.
as the easier option. It's so much easier. I think it's why most people do join them. It's because it's far too uncomfortable to believe that the whole church is apostate right now. The whole visible church is apostate.
Mhm.
And you most likely will ask me that today. You'll say, what is your ecclesiology? If the whole church is apostate, what are we supposed to do? But I will just tell you, Ruben, I would have done that if I was in my flesh. I would have just joined the Orthodox or the Catholics. But having studied the Fathers very intensely for the last 10 years, and having done it with my brothers, and reading the post-Nicene Fathers quite a bit, especially the ones living in the 300s and 400s, we can see clearly that the Orthodox Church is heretical in massive respects. And I can name 10 for you if you'd like. Sins that are absolutely excusable, and not just things that they practice but openly condemn, but that they practice and openly endorse as essential aspects of the faith that are damnable.
Hmm. Hmm. And that's super interesting that you kind of got into this, not part of the David Berceau wave or anything. Did your dad end up joining a particular church, or did he do some kind of house church? How did it work practically?
He met up with a lot of people online. He also spoke with David Berceau over the phone a few times, but my dad never did end up joining any of those churches. His biggest issue with Berceau was Berceau's denial of infant baptism, which of course we all believe in infant baptism, and anybody who denies that is off their rocker. The church fathers are so explicit about it.
Yeah, it's
Even
a tough one.
Yeah, even Tertullian says it. Tertullian, when he discourages it, he said it when he was becoming a Montanist, but even then, he says that it's dangerous for a baby to be baptized because they can never be rebaptized. He says that baptism will count, and he's concerned about them falling away from the faith if you already know all this. So yeah, even Tertullian does not deny infant baptism or the effect of infant baptism. So it is a unanimous teaching from the Ante-Nicene Church. You've got Hippolytus, Apostolic Constitutions, Cyprian, Irenaeus, Tertullian. You've got Justin Martyr going in depth about the fulfillment of circumcision in baptism. We all know
Mhm.
that babies were circumcised. So
Yeah,
yeah, that one's not a hard one. Origen, of course, Origen saying this apostolic practice. It's many witnesses.
yeah. I would say they have exactly one quote that they can point to, and it's the one by Justin when he says that the difference between circumcision and baptism is our own choice. It's a pretty good one, but it's literally the only thing they could possibly point to, and it's just not enough.
I'm not aware of any such quote. I have done a lot of
Really?
study on this subject. If you have a quote like that, I'd like to see it.
Oh yeah, it is by far the best piece of evidence that the believers baptism guys have from the early church, but it's also the only piece of evidence that they have. I wonder where it is. Just Martyr.
I've had many, many debates with people, never seen anybody bring that forward, so I'd be interested to see that.
Really, that's shocking because it's a really good quote for him. Let's see if I can pull it up here.
How old are you, Ruben?
I am 26.
I see, we're the same age.
Okay. Um, okay, yeah, he says, we learned the reason for this practice from the apostles. Whereas we did not perceive our first birth, we have necessarily been born of fluid seed according to our parents' sexual intercourse with each other. We have been in lousy habits and wicked upbringings. In order that we may remain as children of neither mere necessity nor ignorance, but of choice and knowledge, and so that we also obtain forgiveness of sins previously committed in the water. The name of the Father of all and the Master God is pronounced over the one having chosen rebirth for himself and repented of what was sinned.
I see. I
This,
am I am familiar with this quote. Yes,
oh,
I but this is not contrasting Old Testament with New Testament. If anybody would ever say that, that is so deceptive. He's talking about being a pagan, going from a pagan to a Christian. But he would never say, "Oh, in the Old Testament we had circumcision, that was against our will, but now in the New Testament we don't." He's not saying that. He's just saying
yeah, I'm
we.
with you there. I think the infant or the infant baptism case from history is very, very strong.
Yes, he goes hard in talking about the fulfillment of circumcision in baptism, and no Anabaptist agrees with that.
Have you interacted much with like the Kingdom Fellowship weekend crowd?
Oh
Have you
yes,
ever?
oh yes, yes. We've talked to Brousseau's right hand men, Jason Willis and Daniel Willis, and others.
Nice.
Yes, we have the calls. We even got to record them, and we've never published them anywhere online because frankly they were just duds. They just didn't even want to discuss it. And I really
Mm.
think that all of us agree these guys are depending on Berceau to be their leader. And Berceau is in a really dangerous spot where he really is the smartest person in the room. He's done most of the research, and these guys do not do nearly as much research. They do virtually no research compared to Berceau. They're copying a lot of their materials from his works when they're making their sermons about the early church's beliefs. And that's a dangerous thing to do. It's a dangerous place to be in where you're the smartest person. Everybody respects you and thinks you're so smart. Nobody challenges you. But we in our fellowship for the last 10 years, when we have, as we're all discussing these things together, if we run into something that's challenging, we actually will challenge each other and say, are we wrong about this? We might actually be wrong about this. We may need to reverse course on this. And we have done that on many issues. And we
Mm.
conformed our beliefs to the early church. And most of the beliefs of the early church you find in the post-Nicene church in the 300s and 400s.
Mm.
Only a few things changed after the church got involved with the government. And the biggest sins that the church commits after Nicaea is that they allow the emperor to interfere in church affairs, and that the emperors are even interfering with ordinations. And then there's also the issue of them being drafted into war, and that the emperors were cozying up to Christianity because they needed soldiers. Those are the two big things: war and ordinations being corrupted. But virtually everything else in the faith remained exactly the same.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, yeah, there's a lot of ways we can go with this conversation. I think um, maybe to give you a short explanation of why I'm considering orthodoxy.
Yes, please do.
It's so I joined Fathers of the Way like 3 years ago, and the main reason I did was the early church arguments. You know, having grown up in an evangelical church, um, I just always kind of assumed like, well, my church does what the Bible teaches, right? And it was, I'm sure you've heard of Finney Curavella.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So I actually worked for his company for a few years. It was how I met him. Um, and it was him. It was actually his sermon on the head covering that I found online after he mentioned that he had a sermon. He had sermons on YouTube. I looked him up. I found that sermon. I thought, okay, he's a fundamentalist, crazy person. But I watched it, and you know, his biblical arguments were strong. But the most compelling thing by far was just the argument that every church everywhere did this until about 100 years ago. That was kind of an open and shut case for me, and it also led me to ask, like, well, are there other things like that that the church historically practiced that it no longer practices? So then the next thing was they have a debate online about just war theory with David Brousseau and Dean Taylor, and I found that pretty compelling. And I kind of went down the David Brousseau rabbit hole. I read some of his books, became generally convinced of the early Christian Sermon on the Mount um, idea, like that they had these more strict, rigorous positions. So I switched to Flowers of the Way. Um, Also became convinced of baptismal regeneration and just the sacraments in general. That's pretty important to our church. So I was baptized again um, with more of my own choice in it. Now it's a funny thing where Followers of the Way is Baptist. They're adult Baptist, but they are also sacramental, and so they have this idea that like you need to be like fully able to make your own choice, fully mature in that sense. And so even though I was previously baptized at 15, I felt okay. I don't know if I was really serious about it though. Um, let's do it again just to be sure, where I'm like fully with it. Um, so I did that. Um, that was about 3 years ago. Um, and to make a long story short, one of my friends, whom I think you've spoken to, Jonathan Rogers, joined the Orthodox Church about a year ago. And one of the things that he pointed out to me, maybe like 4 months ago, I spoke to him after not seeing him for a while. He pointed out that the early church unanimously viewed the church itself as visible, one one body marked by one cup. Um, that was kind of surprising to me because it was one example where the early church actually believed something radically different from what we believe. right? As Protestants, um, we believe in an invisible church, and that is kind of the opposite of what the early church believed. So that was interesting to me, that there is actually something that the Orthodox can throw back at us and say, like, hey, you say that we don't do what the early church believed, but also you don't believe what the early church believed on the matter of the church. That was pretty interesting to me. But I would say the bigger thing has actually been investigating how authority worked in the early church to actually determine what doctrine is, and how we um, clarify points of practice and doctrine through conciliar authority, through the councils, right? um, we at Followers of the Way would say, like, well, they don't have any authority to tell us what to do. If a church council gets together and decides that we should venerate icons, we don't care, because at the end of the day, only the Bible is our authority.
And that's wrong,
The
of
main,
course. That's wrong, of course. We would all say that's wrong.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But there is a point where the authority of the church stops, and we would say, well, you don't get to tell me what to do because you've now compromised on these things. The problem is, it's those councils that authoritatively close our biblical canon. That we don't actually have a scriptura with which we can do sola scriptura without the authority of the church.
Is that
Because,
is that the biggest problem for you? Is it that the church determines the canon and therefore you don't even have a canon and you don't even have Christianity? So you have to be relying on these councils to some degree?
somewhat, yeah.
All right,
Not
that's
just canon though, because it's also just looking at how. So I asked the question, when we say the early church believes blank, right? When we say the early church dogmatically said that you can't ever use violence, for example. How do we actually back that up? Well, the main approach is we just get together every quote on the subject and we say, see, they all agree. But then there's a couple questions that I asked about that. One being, can we place the full weight of our doctrinal position on each individual quote? Um, so, for example, Justin Martyr, he says a few things like, we have learned to forge our swords into plowshares. We no longer go to war even with our enemies. Great stuff. Can I, from those quotes, prove that Justin Martyr believed that no Christian could ever use violence in defense of the innocent? Can I say Justin Martyr believed that based on the quotes that we have from him? Well, not necessarily. He spoke pretty strongly against war, but I don't know if I can put the full weight of the position on those statements by Justin.
sure. I understand that. But Ruben, since the Orthodox Church does approve of war, you should always just start with the most extreme thing that they teach. Because if you
Well, they
can
don't approve of it.
yes, they don't approve of war?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you read the canons of Basil, which is still the position of the church when it comes to war, Basil basically says killing is awful, and if a soldier kills in battle, he has to do penance for several years. That being said, there's sometimes just no other option.
Right.
Um,
And they still say the
this
same
is what,
thing to this day.
yeah, 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 yeah. They do,
But
they
we
do.
know that the Orthodox Church is very pro-war and has been for many centuries. The Orthodox Church has personally financed and been involved in wars like it is at this very moment. They've been involved in this war. The Orthodox Church of Russia and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And we know like in the 1400s, one of their favorite moments in history is their fighting of the Ottoman Turks. I mean, they're always stressing the importance of having the emperor involved in the church, their Holy Roman Emperor. Their emperors are always going to war in the name of God. The bishops are supporting the emperor, and the emperor supports the bishops. They brag about fighting against the Muslims. They always say, that was our war. We fought this war. So that yeah, they have been very proud of their wars and very pro-war for a long time, despite saying you have to do penance if you killed somebody.
Don't you think there's a difference between like Kirill? like Kirill, I can think you could fairly describe him as pro-war. I think that's pretty obvious. But he has also been rebuked for that by many other bishops. Like there's a difference between saying individual bishops over the history of church have been pro-war rather than the entire church has been pro-war. Um,
Well, Ruben, it has been the entire church. It always has been the entire church, and even to this day, they still say that. They are very proud of their wars that they fought against the Muslims. Those are their most famous wars. And why is there not a system in place? If this is a sin, because we're talking about the sin of murder, that's what
mhm.
war is, why is there not a system in place to excommunicate and depose a fake bishop like Kirill? Why is there no system in place? Why does he just continue? If he really is not a Christian, if he is a flaming heretic, why isn't the church getting rid of him? And the fact is, there is no way to get rid of him because the government is the one that puts him in power.
Mhm. Um, I mean, it seems pretty clear throughout the history of the church there have been ways to get rid of bishops. It seems to be a slow process. It's hard to get it done, but it clearly happens.
It's not going to happen to Kirill. And this kind of thing has continued for a long time that ultimately the one who decides if somebody will be deposed is the emperor. That's been going on since the 300s. People can't be deposed apart from the emperor. He makes the ultimate decision. And now,
What would you how would you support that?
well, starting after the Council of Nicaea, I would support it with all the evidence from because right after Constantine, you have his son Constantius, and Constantius is deposing and appointing bishops left and right all over, causing the Arian crisis. He only appoints Arian crisis, and he only appoints Arian bishops, and he deposes every single bishop who is not an Arian or who doesn't convert to Arianism. And then you have a couple more bishops, or you have a couple more emperors doing that until you have Theodosius. And then Theodosius is doing all the bishop appointments. That continued for so many centuries. You'll have to look into the history of this, that the emperors have been the main people who choose bishops and who perform depositions. With their single decree, that guy's not a bishop anymore. The person ceases to be a bishop. And the whole church has recognized, oh, that's so sad. John Chrysostom's not a bishop anymore. He's deposed by the emperor. He's being replaced with somebody else. At the Council of Constantinople, the first one, when Theodosius is about to reaffirm the Nicene Creed after over 40 years had gone by of Arian bishops, which, by the way, is totally destructive to apostolic succession, that they had many appointments all over in the church for 40 years by Arians, by excommunicated people, excommunicated by the Council of Nicaea. But anyway, after 40 years, Theodosius was about to appoint a successor to the See of Constantinople. And he had all the bishops present, many of which who had been Arians and were completely fake bishops in the first place. He had them give him a list of people that he would appoint to be the bishop. He didn't say, you guys simply choose somebody. He said, give me a list of people that you would think are good candidates, and I will choose one to be the Bishop of Constantinople. So they gave him a list from top to bottom of, best candidates to worst candidates. And at the bottom was just some people who happened to be present, who a lot of them were not even baptized. They were just officials. And at the very bottom of the list, they actually told, they put Theodosius's own praetor, one of his governors, they put him at the bottom of the list because he wasn't even a baptized Christian. And Theodosius did this joke thing. He said, well, Jesus says the first shall be last and the last shall be first. He says, I want him to be Bishop of Constantinople right now. And they all were in uproar and said, Theodosius, he's not even a baptized Christian. We cannot make him Bishop of Constantinople. And he told them, do it right now. And they were up in arms. All of them were saying, this breaks all the canons. This would be completely unlawful. And they said, please don't make us do it, Theodosius, because they were such spineless cowards. And he gave them no other option. And they baptized and then ordained him on the spot and put the robes on him and said, you're the Bishop of Constantinople, Mr. Roman governor. And they did the same thing with Ambrose. And you just need to look into history a little more to see this is what the emperors have been doing for many centuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I'm not familiar with that particular story.
Well, it's not just one or two. It's many. Just so you know, it's many, many, many. It happened with Ambrose. He's another one. It happened with John Chrysostom, as well as John Chrysostom's deposition and execution. It happened with Cyril, and it happened with many others. It happened with at the Second Council of Nicaea. Empress Irene appointed her own royal imperial secretary to be the Bishop of Constantinople to preside over the Second Council of Nicaea, that totally fake council. Whereas the real Bishop of Constantinople, well, if you want to call him real, he actually was an iconoclast. He had written many books against it. And Irene told him, you're not going to be bishop anymore. And she took her royal imperial secretary and made him bishop. That's how it's been going for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So, um, let me go back to what I was saying earlier about like how do we say the early church believed blank, right? I was given this example of just war by saying like, can we put the full position on each individual that we pull to support that position? Can we say Justin Martyr believed in no violence ever based on the quotes that we have from him? I'm not sure. Um, but then the other point is authority. Um, we pull quotes from a lot of kind of random people like, okay, Lactantius. Um, why does it matter what Lactantius believed? He wasn't a bishop. So why is he authoritative in these conversations? He is helpful as, an example of what a Christian believed about this subject, but he's not quite an authority, right?
Right.
Not every person on our quote list actually necessarily has authority to really inform us on what we should believe. Would you agree with that?
Right. You have to look at what the whole church says. And the whole church altogether values the writings of certain men, even if they were not a bishop, such as Justin Martyr or Tertullian or Lactantius. And the church says what these men teach is orthodox. And you have men like all the historians like Eusebius and Jerome saying these are the men that the church has always held in high esteem with their writings. Their writings represent the church's teachings. So it's the unanimous testimony. It would be foolish just to take one person's writing and say this is the whole church's teaching. But it's very convenient that they all agree with each other. That way
Mm-hmm.
we can just take what all their teachings together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think, Ruben, you have to start with war. You can't start with self-defense. Start with war. See if the church does unanimously condemn war in all kinds, all its forms. And if it does, then you know that it's a heresy when they start endorsing war.
Um, I'm not sure if I agree with that, but we can come back to it. Let's see, where was I going with this?
By the way, have you read the Acts of any of the councils, like Council of Ephesus or Chalcedon?
Excerpts.
Do you know that they say in the canons that you never need to quote more than 10 church fathers on any subject to establish the orthodoxy of a doctrine?
I did not know that. Um, that's interesting.
They even give a list, like Vincent of Lerins gives the Council of Ephesus. He says these are the 10 church fathers quoted, and he gives a list. He's quoting some Ante-Nicene, some post-Nicene, and he says this is all you really need. He says nobody, they said at the council, you'd have to be insane to demand more than 10. 10 church fathers who died in the peace of the church, who died in the unity of the church. If you ever demanded 10, if you ever said, I think these 10 are all heretics, I think they're all going against the unity of the church. He said, Council of Ephesus said you just have to be out of your mind to ever suggest such a thing. And we agree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's reasonable to me. Um, what's interesting is how like authority and ecclesiology kind of come together when we start looking at councils. Like, okay, so the Quartodeciman controversy, for example. It's interesting that when Ephesus is on a different date of Easter, that the rest of the church sees that as a big problem. Like, obviously, they were not congregational, right?
What do you mean by that?
Congregational is a form of church authority where just the local church has authority over the local church and some other church can't tell it what to do. It's just the buck stops at the local congregation's leaders.
Well, the way we see church authority being structured is that a bishop is appointed by other bishops. He teaches the people in that congregation, that appointed bishop, who is elected by all the people and confirmed by the bishops. And then if the laity ever suspect that this man is teaching a heresy that contradicts the rest of the churches, then they will
Mm-hmm.
go and contact other bishops to come and investigate. and they will either tell the laity to submit to him, or they will confirm that he is a heretic or practicing some sin, and they'll tell him to either repent or be deposed. And if he's deposed, then they end up electing a new one. So it's actually a combination of the two. It's that the bishop has authority, and if the people think he's teaching something wrong, they can go call other bishops to investigate it.
Yeah, amen. Amen. I think it's very clear that the early church believed that, and that's how they practiced it. So then, um, but like the Quartodeciman controversy, this local church is expected to fall in line with the practice and the beliefs of the church as a whole. That's interesting. And we start seeing this conciliar model on how do they actually establish what is the doctrine and the practice of the whole church. We have these councils, and that's where we really hash things out, right? It's where we see Cyprian in 250 when there's a question about baptism. Should we do it on day 1 or day 8? How do we resolve this question? Well, we have a council, and that the results of that council are then authoritative over the whole church, right? You've observed the same thing.
Well, I think that the church already has. I mean, the truth is the truth, whether the council recognizes it or not. We know that Cyprian had another council, even though that one was unanimous in saying you can baptize the baby at any time. Cyprian had a later council saying that there has to be rebaptism for every person. And
Mm-hmm.
according to the historians, such as Jerome and Vincent of Lerins and others, Augustine, those three say that nobody in the rest of the church recognized Cyprian's council. And Jerome says that the people, every single person who was convened at that council, that they were saying Stephen was wrong to say their first baptisms were legitimate. They say Cyprian himself and every person at that council reversed their decision when they saw no one else agreed with them.
Well, they ended up coming to kind of a middle ground position, actually, where Stephen was just like, everybody can just get chrismated. Um, and Cyprian said, no, nobody gets to be chrismated. Everyone needs to be baptized. What they ended up coming to was a middle ground between the two of it needs to have proper form for someone to be received only through chrismation. You need to have proper form. If there was not proper form, such as a non-Trinitarian formula, then they do need to be rebaptized. And so Cyprian has a local council, right? But what ends up being authoritative for everyone is the consensus of the ecumenical church. Would you say that's reasonable?
Yes, the ecumenical church. By the way, we would consider all the quotes of the fathers to be an ecumenical council. That's something that Vincent of Lerins says. He says the quotes alone, when you put them together, is equal to an ecumenical council.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Vincent of Lerins says that, but um, why does that make it true? Because you believe in kind of a consensus-based model, right? Where multiple, you just said if 10 people say it, then it's the witness of the early church. Do we have 10 people saying that a list of quotes is equal to an ecumenical council?
Well, it's also just common sense. I would say that to say that somebody loses authority after they've written something and that it needs to come out of their living mouth, I'd say they're just making that up. A person has just as
I,
much authority in their writing as verbally teaching it.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I would nod
Are
with
we
that.
just going to throw out the apostles because they're not alive speaking it? All we have are their writings? Because that is ultimately where that kind of thinking would lead us.
Well, no, that wasn't really my point. Um, what I was disputing was the idea that 10 voices, whether written or verbal, that would be equal to an ecumenical council.
Well, God worked it
Because
out that we would.
that's kind of stops.
You're saying just that specific belief that 10 is equal to an ecumenical council. You're asking where that idea comes from.
Yeah.
Well, I actually don't even have to answer that because if you only have two options, either you have our belief that would say that just go with the unanimous teaching, which we find them to be unanimous on virtually everything, or you go with the Orthodox, and the Orthodox are the ones who say that at their ecumenical council. So you've only got two options. Either way, what we're saying is correct.
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
I was saying I don't have to prove that. I don't have to prove that that's correct because everyone, whether you're in our camp or the Orthodox, you would agree with
Mhm.
that.
Oh, because it's from Chalcedon.
Yes. No, Ephesus.
Understood. Oh, Ephesus. Okay, understood. Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
We already know that they're unanimous. So we don't even just need 10. We would just say they all say it. They all say the same thing on virtually every doctrine you could think of.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. So, okay, you accurately predicted that I would ask this question. What do you believe the church is?
We do believe in a visible church. We don't think that the church is invisible like a Protestant would say. But we do also think it's just really silly to go on and on about this visible church stuff. Let me be practical with you in this. Would you say
Mhm.
that there is a visible church in China right now?
Uh, well, I mean, I don't really feel equipped to answer that question because I'm investigating the claims of orthodoxy to that title, and
Okay,
I
okay.
haven't really.
All right. I will not pretend you're Orthodox, but I was just saying hypothetically, if you're going to ask the Orthodox question, you could look at it from an Orthodox perspective, and of course they'd have to say no. There is no visible Orthodox church in China. Is there a visible Orthodox church in North Korea? No. Is there a visible Orthodox church in Saudi Arabia? No. Is there a visible Orthodox church in most places in Africa? No, there's not. In fact, they didn't even start evangelizing in Africa until the late 1800s. They didn't even care. I don't know what it is with the Orthodox, but they are just not as big on evangelization as the Catholics. That's why the Catholics have beaten them, because the Catholics are always going all around the world. When they went to the New World and they went to South America, they were serious about spreading the word. But the Orthodox don't care so much. We could just ask them, and I would ask them, and I have asked them, what do you mean by a visible church? Do you mean that this church is visible everywhere you look? Like, if I'm standing in my room and I look out my window, does there have to be an Orthodox church? And they say, well, no, it's somewhere. Like, okay, does there have to be an Orthodox church in my city? Because there's no Orthodox church in my city where I live. And they say, well, okay, it has to be somewhere around there. Okay, where? Does it have to be within 2 hours driving distance? Or 2 hours walking distance? Like, how visible does this Orthodox church have to be? Because I can already prove there are many places in the earth that do not have a visible Orthodox church. I don't know what this
But
is. What do you think?
why would it disprove the visible church theology if a particular location doesn't have it?
Because their idea is that it's not a visible church. By the way, they invented this. I'm asking why there has to be a visible church. That's a second question. But I would just say, let's assume there has to be a visible church. Where does it have to be visible? If that's true, they're saying, look, you guys only exist in this small pocket in the world, and we're saying, but you guys also exist in small pockets of the world. So does that invalidate the Orthodox Church as well?
No. I think this is kind of okay. So here's what I'm getting at by visible church: one holy Catholic apostolic. This is how the early church defined it, right? This is how Nicaea defines it. What I'm really talking about is what Cyprian talks about in On the Unity of the Church, where what the definition of the visible church is to be part of, to be in communion with, for lack of better words, the institution of the church.
Right. Yeah, we believe that
That
existed. We believe that existed. We believe there is still an institution that's segmented and cut up into a bunch of little bits, but
Mhm.
that every single segment, all of the daughters of that mother, that big mother harlot, all the daughters are harlots too. You can be joined to that church. You can be from a lineage of that church, but they're all heretical. I would also ask the Orthodox, where was this big visible institution during the Arian crisis that lasted for 40 years? And they will have no answer because it didn't exist. They'll say, well, that was just a one time thing. Okay.
of course, it existed.
There was a
It
visible institution of the church during the 40-year Arian crisis?
Yeah, it was infiltrated by many heretics, but that doesn't dissolve it, right? Why would it dissolve it?
Well, the only bishops in the church were Arians who had excommunicated all the legitimate bishops and exiled them.
Um,
All the legitimate bishops had been kicked out. Do you want me to show you a few statements saying that from Athanasius and Hilary of Poitiers and Jerome?
every single bishop that was not Arian had been kicked out.
Yes, every single bishop except they say like 5 or 6.
Well, there's your remnant.
Right, and they were not visible. They were all in the desert. They were not allowed in any of the cities. And you
Um,
got to understand, they say it was a handful. They say it was a tiny handful. There's also Lucifer of Cagliari, tiny number of bishops. And you got to understand, there were still a few people that refused to believe like their bishops were teaching them, but they lived nowhere near Athanasius. They lived nowhere near Hilary. They were all by themselves out in the desert. And Basil and Athanasius and others say they were out there just doing their thing all by themselves. They had no bishop to submit to. And
Okay.
God worked that out, that there would be a time in the church just so that the Orthodox Church would look stupid when they say that. It happened in the 300s. That's the only reason God worked that out.
I definitely would be interested in those quotes.
I can show you right now. You want? I'll just read a few. I will not take up a lot of time if you don't have much time.
I got time. I'm chilling right now.
Okay, cool. Let me read a few here. Let me see here. Here, I'll share screens. This is on the website. I can also send you this link if you'd like to look at it. I'm going to drop it right here. So I sent you also the Orthodox definition thing. I sent that to you because although Vincent of Lerins is already considered by the Orthodox to represent the Orthodox teaching, Vincent is really just summarizing what all the other church fathers say about how, you know, if you have the majority of all the fathers saying something, all the most respected and righteous men who died in the peace of the church, all saying the same thing, that has to be the teaching of the church. So this is a separate section we made on apostasy. I'll go down to Athanasius. So there's some scriptures here that talk about fleeing heretical priests, that if you stay with an evil priest, he'll destroy you. Lots and lots of prophecies in the scriptures about that. And then, you've got Ignatius also telling you, flee from heretical priests. This idea of unconditional surrender to heretical priests did not exist. First Clement is all about you needing to not join schismatics, not join heretics. First Clement
Of
is one of
course.
our best letters against what the Catholics teach, the Catholics.
That's so interesting because I see it the total opposite.
Well, you have to ask, who is the schismatic? The one who teaches the heresy, or the people who refuse to go along with the heretical bishop?
No, I agree with that, but isn't there a difference between um, fleeing individual heretics and leaving the entire communion of the church, starting a new one?
Well, there is a difference, but both were commanded to do both. I mean, we were never told to obey some random heretic in the first place. But you've got to read these quotes, Ruben. You've got to read what the church says about leaving, fleeing from
I've read that.
heretical bishops.
I've been scrolling through that page actually.
Yes.
Um, I mean, there's a
Cyprian.
ton. Sorry, go
Cyprian.
ahead.
Cyprian has so much now. So much. He says, for which reason you must diligently observe and keep the practice delivered from divine tradition and apostolic observance. By the way, if we highlight something in red, that just means it's a really good quote. And if it's in purple, it's an insanely good quote. And if it's just in white, that just means it's there for context. You don't have to read it. But yeah.
Mhm.
But he says, nor let the people flatter themselves that they can be free from the contagion of sin while communicating with a priest who is a sinner, and yielding their consent to the unjust and unlawful episcopacy of their overseer, when the divine reproof by Hosea the prophet threatens and says, their sacrifices shall be as the bread of morning, all that eat thereof shall be polluted, teaching manifestly and showing that all are absolutely bound to the sin who have been contaminated by the sacrifice of a profane and unrighteous priest, which moreover we find to be manifest also in Numbers, when Korah and Dathan and Abiram claimed for themselves the power of sacrificing in opposition to Aaron the priest. By the way, he's talking about two men who were lawfully ordained as priests, but who became
Yeah,
sinners.
yeah.
He's, yeah, he
No,
just
amen. Those are all good for leaving individual heretical priests. I 100% agree with that.
right. But if the
But
whole Orthodox and Catholics teach the same thing, we have to leave all of them.
well, let me just ask you this: in Cyprian's situation that he's proposing, if you're under a heretical priest, where do you think Cyprian wants you to go, or what do you think he wants you to do specifically? Do you think he wants you to find another priest part of the church, or does he want you to start your own group?
Well, Cyprian wouldn't call it starting your own group if you were unable to find any bishop that taught the same thing. He would encourage you to travel from one city to another. But God's given us the internet, so we know what they all teach. We know there is no group that is teaching what the early church taught. And that only remains to be proven to you. But the principle is there. If nobody teaches what the early church
No,
taught,
it's a totally different principle. Um, the principle of leaving an individual heretical priest and going to a faithful church within the one holy Catholic Apostolic Church, that is a totally different principle from leaving your heretical priest to start a new movement. Because we know from the early church's writings that starting a different church was not considered to be an equally valid church. I mean, Cyprian is crystal clear about this. Those bodies that are outside of the communion of the church, they don't have sacraments because they're not part of the church.
Right. But you're going to do a new subject now, Ruben. It's the question of what are we supposed to do? How can we have a
Related.
church without the priests? But if I can prove that they did say we can do the sacraments without priests, then that argument doesn't work.
I don't agree. I think the subjects are, you can't separate
Well, I
them.
agree that they're connected, but you're just jumping to something. You're assuming that it's unlawful to do the sacraments apart from priests, but we can prove that it is lawful. We can prove that Cyprian, who is always reading Tertullian every single day, agreed with Tertullian's teaching that the laity can all offer the Eucharist if their priests are either heretical or dead.
Um,
And by the
Interesting.
way,
Yeah,
and by the way,
I'd like.
Cyprian in this very letter says that someday all the priests will fall away. Many church fathers say this, that someday all the priests will fall away.
So, see, I looked through your quote list and I didn't find a single one that said
Let me
that.
show
So
you.
we're,
Let me show you.
yeah,
But he just says here, there also the Lord commanded by Moses that the people should be separated from them, lest being associated with the wicked, themselves also should be bound closely in the same wickedness. So, of course, this would mean if you have no righteous priest to go to, you don't just choose one and say, well, I don't want to be separated from the whole church. You have to separate from all the wicked. Separate yourselves, said he, from the tents of these wicked and hardened men, and touch not those things which belong to them, lest you perish together in their sins. On which account a people obedient to the Lord's precepts and fearing God ought to separate themselves from a sinful prelate. By the way, the Orthodox Church does not teach this. They think you should obey the priest even if he is an adulterer and a murderer. That's their teaching.
I don't think that's true at all.
They do. They say leave it to other bishops to go and do the deposition. You stay with that bishop or a priest.
Um, I don't think they would tell you to just accept the situation. I mean, I've talked to actual Orthodox people about that, and they would not agree with what you're saying.
Well, they themselves will allow practicing sinners. It all extends. With that church that I visited in here in Texas, it's a big one. It's a very famous one here in Texas. Um, he said that he has fornicators in his church. The priest told me Seraphim Hamilton, or wait, not Seraphim Hamilton. Oh, I cannot remember his name, but they all name themselves Seraphim. That's why we get them mixed up.
Yeah, they love that guy.
No, but he said, I have fornicators in my church. He says, I have people living together, and I give them communion every Sunday. Because he said, I'd rather they be here than out there. Whatever that means.
That sounds like malpractice by him, but again,
Well,
that
again,
doesn't.
if that's what they're doing in the Orthodox churches, and that's not just one church, that's many churches that they do that, then why would we be surprised that they think even the priests, if they approve of these things, that you can't just get rid of the priest, would anybody ever oppose that priest? Would anybody? Nobody has, by the way. Nobody stood up to that man and said, you're a heretic, to actually allow these people to teach that it's a better thing for them to be sinning in the church than to be sinning outside of the church and to receive the Eucharist at your hands. None of them believe this doctrine that we're reading right here.
Mhm.
That's not in the Orthodox Church. He says, anyway, and not to associate themselves with the sacrifices of a sacrilegious priest. And by the way, this is not Cyprian just being extreme. I can show you all the fathers saying this. Post-Nicene as well.
Yeah,
Yes,
no, I would agree with you. If a local church is doing that, that would be very bad.
right.
Um,
Yes,
Against what they themselves teach in their canon law,
right.
right? But if a church is disobedient to the teachings of the church, like that's a problem for that local church, not for the entire institution. Does that make sense?
Well, we just have to find out what the laity are expected to do. If the laity are told to flee a sinful priest, there would be no exception for that. There wouldn't be, well, if all the priests are sinful, then you have to choose one of them. That's not a teaching in the early church.
There would be a presupposition there that all of them, in fact, are sinful.
Right, and I'm waiting. I mean, we're ready to join any church that somebody can prove has legitimate priests. We'd be happy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But if they
But
go ahead.
I guess I'm not convinced yet that. So your list of quotes on apostasy has a ton of good quotes about like What do you do if an individual local church has sinful leadership or heretical leadership? Those are all good. They don't address anything about the entire institution falling away. And that's really the main thing
We
that
do have some. We do have some. But by the way, Ruben, let's be logical. Even if we didn't have quotes, and we do, I'm about to read a few right here. But even if we didn't have those, all that we really need to do is prove that the church has completely contradicted itself to prove that they've fallen away, right?
I would agree with that.
So
Yeah.
we don't need a quote, but thank God we do have quotes. So here's the first one. He says, especially since they themselves, the laity, have the power either of choosing worthy priests or of rejecting unworthy ones. For which reason, by the way, we're not Bersoites. We don't believe we can just ordain our own priests. We're not crazy like that. This, of course, would have to still be done with the bishops laying hands on them and ordaining them. But we would elect them. The church elects bishops to be ordained. Anyway, he says, for which reason you must diligently observe and keep the practice delivered from divine tradition and apostolic observance, which is also maintained among us and almost throughout all the provinces. Nor let it disturb you, dearest brethren, if with some, in these last times, either an uncertain faith is wavering, or a fear of God without religion is vacillating, or a peaceable concord does not continue. These things have been foretold as about to happen in the end of the world, and it was predicted by the voice of the Lord and by the testimony of the apostles, that now that the world is failing and the Antichrist is drawing near, everything good shall fail. Now, what is he referring to? What's the subject here in this letter? Bishops falling away. Everything
Um,
good shall fail. But he
Trying to
continues,
move the
uh,
page here.
yeah, that's the whole subject.
Speaker here.
What was that?
Who's the author here?
Cyprian?
Just trying to navigate to it on your page.
Yeah, it's on letter 67. Yes, he says, now that the world is failing and the Antichrist is drawing near, everything good shall fail, but evil and adverse things shall prosper. And how do we know he's talking about priests? Because of the next sentence. Yet, although in these last times evangelic rigor has not so failed in the church of God, nor the strength of Christian virtue or faith so languished that there is not left a portion of priests, which in no respect gives way under these ruins of things and wrecks of faith. So what is he insinuating? That he's saying, yet that's not happened yet in these last times, that there isn't left a portion. What is he insinuating except that there will be a time when there is not left a portion? Because he just said, everything good shall fail, and yet that hasn't happened yet. The whole subject is priests falling away. Do you see that?
I don't. No, I don't see it, Luke.
Let's read it one more
Because
time. Let's read it one
no,
more
hold
time.
on. You don't have to read it to me. I got it in front of me here. So he says this is what's going to happen in the end times, and then he says we are in the end times, right? And we still have a faithful remnant. So these conditions being met, we still have a faithful remnant of priests. He seems to be saying the exact opposite of what you're insinuating, that he's encouraging the church that even in the end times where everything good is failing, we still have a faithful remnant of priests.
Reuben, he's literally prophesying after Christ the falling away of the church at the Arian crisis, when the whole church literally did that, literally completely fell away, where there
And
was there
but
was no more institution.
he says there is still a portion of priests.
Yes, he has.
So
It has not so failed in the church of God. So he's saying that hasn't happened yet in these last times. It has not so failed that there's not left a portion. But he says it will happen. He says, among very many of us, there still remains a sincere mind and a substantial religion and a spirit devoted to nothing but the Lord and its God. But he says everything good shall fail in the future. Listen,
um,
listen to what else he says. Listen to what else he says. Because this is just the section about bishops, about us needing to not obey an evil bishop, that we should flee from him. Then he has a separate section we have for just apostasy. He makes another prophecy here, which happened. This is in Epistle 54. This is when he's talking about heretics actually trying to enter the church again and influence bishops to go along with their ideas. There were some who even tried to, after they'd been excommunicated, they would try to go to other churches pretending they were still a bishop, and that people were listening to their opinions after they'd been excommunicated. He says, "Is the dignity of the Catholic Church, dearest brother, to be laid aside? Is the faithful and uncorrupted majesty of the people placed within it, and the priestly authority and power also, all to be laid aside for this? That those who are set without the Church may say that they wish to judge concerning a prelate in the Church, heretics concerning a Christian, wounded men about a whole man, maimed concerning a sound man, lapsed concerning one who stands fast, guilty concerning their judge, sacrilegious men concerning a priest? What is left but that the church should yield to the capital? It did. And that while the priests depart and remove the Lord's altar, the images and idols should pass over with their altars into the sacred and venerable assembly of our clergy." Again, he says this will happen, that the church will someday yield to the capital. That's exactly what happened. It happened in the Arian crisis, and it continued to happen for every single century after that.
Let me read that again real quick. Where's his yields? Oh, I'm looking at a different quote.
I won't
Oh,
keep reading until
is
you've.
it the same apostasy page?
No, but he's. Oh, yes, it is. Yeah, it's on a separate Cyprian page. First, we have a page where the church fathers say we should flee from heretical priests. Then we have a separate section for when they all say that the church will someday fall away.
My control F word search is failing me right now. I'm trying to quote that
See,
you're on.
see on the right here, we've got one section for Cyprian just talking about fleeing heretical priests, and then you go lower, and then it's just talking about apostasy. Yeah, let me go up a little bit. Church fathers on the apostasy. So we have Origen as our
Oh,
first one. Origen has some very explicit quotes.
what is the but?
Here, let me read. Are you able to? You can finish reading that if you want.
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Even these quotes, though, are more of a comfort than they are a foundation for you to stand on. Because once you've seen from the evidence itself that the church has fallen away, it's comforting to know that this was predicted, not that it happened as some kind of surprise. But even if I were to show you all these quotes, you would still say, well, show me how it's apostatized. So that's really what we should focus on. We should focus on the reality that they are heretics.
Um, yeah, I think I need to see the context of this quote because I'm not sure if it's necessarily prophecy or if he's just being hyperbolic concerning the church's behavior.
Oh, he is. He doesn't think that would ever happen. He doesn't think the church would ever yield to the capital. But it is a prophecy because it happened.
Okay, hold on a minute. You got an interesting definition of prophecy.
Well, sometimes
I
people
don't.
say something without believing it will actually happen. Sometimes they say this is what would happen. Kind of like with Plato. You know, the church fathers say Plato prophesied, God spoke through him when the people said, Plato, what do you think the world would do if there ever was a perfectly righteous man? What do you think? How do you think people would react to him? Have you ever heard this prophecy?
Uh, no.
Plato's
This
he just says that
I think a little bit of a goalpost shift
I know. I'm just
because
saying. I'm not goalpost shifting. I'm just giving you an answer to your question because you said you want to know how this can be prophetic.
well, what I mean is, um, and perhaps I just misunderstood you, but I thought that you were giving me citations of early church fathers actually believing that the church would fall into complete apostasy.
Right. Well,
What?
I will. I mean, I can. That's not the only quote here, as you can see.
Yeah, that's specifically what I'm looking for. Where the early church they actually believed. the whole thing is going to fall into apostasy.
Yeah, you should read them all. I guess you might have stopped reading them because you thought that was all we had. But the ones above were just about fleeing heretical priests. These you have to go a little farther to actually see the apostasy quotes.
Yeah, no, I'm in that section. Um, what would be your best one? Because this is such a huge list. What would be your best one for an early church father that clearly believes the whole church is gonna go to go to hell?
Well, you've got the pre-Nicene church fathers saying that. Origen has some extremely explicit ones saying that in the same way that all of Israel forsook God, the whole New Testament Israel will also forsake God. Those are very explicit. But then once you get to the Arian crisis, now they're just saying, "Oh, it happened. What was prophesied is happening." Like Athanasius. Athanasius would be your best ones.
Okay, yeah. So I still think there's a problem where, like, you believe Cyprian is authoritative, right?
Yes.
And Cyprian tells you you have to be part of the visible church to have a valid sacrament, right?
Well, he agrees with Tertullian. They all agree that in an emergency, you could have the Eucharist without the
Uh,
priests.
does Cyprian directly refer to that, or does he just say at some point, "I love Tertullian"?
Well, he says he reads Tertullian every single day. They're in the same city. He lives just a handful of years after Tertullian. And
Mm-hmm.
Tertullian, this is something that Tertullian taught very explicitly.
Yeah, and he fell into complete apostasy, right?
But, but guys, my goodness, Ruben, I'm not surprised to hear you say that, but I actually am just surprised to keep hearing it. Like I knew you'd say that, but my goodness, are we going to reject the Trinity now because Tertullian taught the Trinity? Are we going to reject faith and works just because he taught that? You have to be logical. You cannot say every doctrine Tertullian taught before he became a heretic has to be heresy just because he later became a heretic. This was never
Well,
condemned. This doctrine he taught was never condemned by the church. The other church fathers teach the same thing. Clement of
I'm not.
Alexandria, Origen, they teach that yes, we all have the authority of a priest in our person if we have the discipline of a priest. That is a doctrine that existed in the church apart from Tertullian, and it continued after Tertullian. John Chrysostom teaches it, many others teach it.
I'm not saying everything Tertullian taught is to be automatically rejected because he taught it. I am saying that if he says a particular thing very strongly, we can't just assume that it was the doctrine of the rest of the church because we know where he was going. We know the outcome of Tertullian's faith and beliefs. And so, unless it is confirmed by other church fathers, I think we should not automatically assume it's right. That's what I'm suggesting about Tertullian.
Certainly, but it is the opposite take that people seem to have. They usually just say, well, it's Tertullian, so we write it off. But you have to be careful, because if you say that this is a heretical doctrine he's teaching, and it turns out that everybody else teaches it, you're condemning the whole church. So really, your only question should be, and who else teaches this? It shouldn't just be, well, that's Tertullian. Because you would accept that Tertullian if the whole church, or you would accept the whole church's doctrine. You would accept this one from Tertullian if everybody else agrees with it, right?
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Okay, so it doesn't really matter if it's Tertullian, because the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church quote from Tertullian all the time. And one of the funny ironies of history, Tertullian is the only person explicitly called a church father in the Catholic Catechism. You can look that up.
That is interesting.
Yes, and the Orthodox quote him all the time. In their, I mean, he's their best person to quote on subjects like signing yourself with the cross. You know, they love him when he's teaching things that they agree with it.
Mm-hmm,
But I
mm-hmm.
mean, we would be pretty silly to say, well, maybe Cyprian just didn't know it. Cyprian, the guy always telling people to stay away from heretical priests, Cyprian probably just didn't even realize this. That Tertullian actually thinks you should have the sacraments apart from heretical priests. Um, and there are exceptions
It,
to every rule.
sure, sure.
For instance, the church all said, starting with Ignatius, they all said that a baptism that is not performed by a bishop is invalid, right?
Um, did they also? I'll take your word for that. Sure.
He says it's not lawful without the bishop either to baptize or to celebrate a love feast, but
Mm-hmm.
whosoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, or whatsoever he shall approve of, that is also pleasing to God, so that everything that is done may be secure and valid. So he's saying it's not secure and it's not valid. It's not necessarily secure and valid if it's not done by the bishop. You need to have the bishop there. Now they take that to mean, oh, you guys cannot possibly have a valid baptism or Eucharist because you do it without the bishop. But we know the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church has always considered baptisms done by the laity to be valid, even if there is no bishop. They consider, as long as it's done properly, in the mode that the church has specified, it is valid. But they say it's disorderly to do it without the bishop, and that you
Mm.
risk making the baptism invalid if you do it improperly. But they've always believed that. They even have their saints like Gennadius and others. They have this story. I mean, they have a saint with a feast day and everything. He's considered a martyr. Gennadius was a guy who he was a pagan doing a play mocking Christianity, and he did a baptism, and then he converted. He actually had this moment where he changed his mind and said he does believe in Christianity, even though he did a mock baptism. It was done correctly. And so they say, oh yeah, he's a real Christian. Athanasius. There's a very famous story you may have heard about Athanasius as a boy baptizing his friends on the beach. They all consider all those baptisms to have been valid. They even say Peter of Alexandria, the bishop, called Athanasius over and questioned him and said, how exactly what words did you say over those kids? They all considered it valid. So the church can have a law. They say it's not lawful to baptize without the priest or to have the Eucharist without the priest. But just because something is not lawful does not mean that it cannot be legitimate. It just means that it's dangerous and disorderly to do it without the bishop.
Mhm. Um, Interesting, interesting. So,
Yeah.
just out of curiosity, how do you intend to get bishops? Are you just going to have your
We don't have any
brothers in
bishops.
the church?
We don't have any bishops. We know that it's the discipline of the person that makes them qualified to offer the sacraments. In the
But
same
do you?
way, in the same way that if you were lawfully ordained, you still couldn't offer the sacraments, if or specifically the sacrifice of the Eucharist, you could not ever offer that if you were a wicked person, because the entire thing that makes it valid is the discipline of the priest and him doing it the way he's supposed to. It's all about the righteousness of that man and the laws of the church being followed. The
Mhm.
ordination is only when they take a person who is righteous and they say, this man who is so holy is going to be entrusted with this because of his manner of life and because of his good education. He is the best person to lead you. But if he turns out wicked, his ordination doesn't benefit him at all. Let me read you a few quotes saying that. Here's Clement of Alexandria. He says, those then also now who have exercised themselves in the Lord's commandments and lived perfectly and gnostically, he just means with knowledge, this is his term that he likes to use a lot. It just means knowledge, have lived perfectly and gnostically according to the gospel, may be enrolled in the chosen body of the apostles. Such a one is in reality a presbyter of the church and a true minister of the will of God, if he do and teach what is the Lord's, not as being ordained by men, nor regarded righteous because a presbyter, but enrolled in the presbyterate because righteous.
Mhm.
Tertullian says the same thing. Accordingly, where there is no joint session of the ecclesiastical order, you offer the Eucharist and baptize, and are priest alone for yourself. But where three are, a church is, albeit they be laics. For each individual lives by his own faith, nor is there exception of persons with God, since it is not the hearers of the law who are justified by the Lord, but doers, according to what the apostle withal says. Therefore, if you have the right of a priest in your own person, in cases of necessity, it behooves you to have likewise the discipline of a priest, whenever it may be necessary to have the right of a priest. If you are a digamist, like the Orthodox and Catholics are into, they're into digamy. He says, do you baptize if you've had multiple wives? If you are a digamist, do you offer the Eucharist? How much more capital a crime is it for a digamist laic to act as a priest, when the priest himself, if he turn digamist, is deprived of the power of acting the priest? But to necessity, you say, indulgence is granted. No necessity is excusable, which is avoidable. In a word, shun to be found guilty of digamy, and you do not expose yourself to the necessity of administering what a digamist may not lawfully administer. God wills us all to be so conditioned as to be ready at all times and places to undertake the duties of his sacraments.
Mhm.
This is
My question was, do you intend to eventually ordain somebody?
of course not. We don't have any authority to do that.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, is
The
like the
discipline
yeah,
is everything. That's what they're saying. The discipline is what would make you qualified to do it, not the ordination.
So if your church grows and it's successful and you're able to get a lot more members, you'll continue to not have ordained leadership.
Of course, we would never ever pretend to have the power to ordain.
That's so interesting. So how would leadership work?
The same way it worked in the deserts when the Arian crisis happened. We're in the same situation. Unless we ever find a church that somehow miraculously has preserved apostolic succession. But apostolic succession consists of two things, Ruben. It consists of the doctrines
No.
being preserved and of the ordinations. And both of those have been destroyed. Neither the doctrines exist from the beginning as they should, nor were the ordinations preserved. You think that you're getting a valid Eucharist from a heretical Orthodox priest just because he has this line of succession. But the truth is, even the line of succession was annihilated many centuries before now. And it's almost like every century the Orthodox realized that. They realized it, like a large group of them realized it in the 1900s. Have you learned about what happened around the time of World War I and World War II when Lenin and
Uh,
Stalin had all the priests massacred?
I've read a little bit about it. Yeah, the pretty horrific persecution.
Yeah,
Yeah.
40,000 priests were killed in like the span of a decade. All of them. And they all were replaced with fake priests, fake bishops. And
Mm-hmm.
the Orthodox Church was actually called the Soviet Orthodox Church of Russia. I mean, they had it in the name. They were all in bed with the government, having champagne with them and everything. And Kirill, of course, comes from a succession. His predecessor was one of those Soviets. They were all fake priests, and a huge group of people left the Orthodox Church when that happened, when they knew that all their priests had been massacred and replaced with fake priests. Of course, this kind of what they don't realize is that this has happened every century. It's just that God works it out. It happens again every century, just so that everybody can be beyond any excuse in the end that the apostolic succession has been destroyed. There's a group of millions of people called Old Believers in Russia. Have you heard about them?
Yep.
They have nothing to do with any of the institutional church because they know how corrupt it is. You can look at it. All the Orthodox can look at it and say, okay, this is the fakest church ever. Their leader, their Kirill, is a KGB agent. It's well known, not even a hidden fact. He's best friends. He receives hundreds of millions of dollars from Vladimir Putin. He owns an oil company. His net worth is 6 billion. He has a private yacht. He goes out
Mm-hmm.
and hangs out with girls on his yacht. I mean, he has multi like $100 million mansions. He has his own island, and they think that guy could possibly be a bishop. But that's what's happened. God's made it as obvious as possible that this so-called Orthodox Church is just a joke. Of course, they've got their Elpidophoros or Bishop Bartholomew. They've got these guys in Constantinople now endorsing gay marriage. I mean, it's as obviously fallen as it could be, but it's just century after century people have to see this, and anybody who persists in it, calling that God's church, they're beyond excuse, Ruben. I know I'm just preaching to you at this point, but I'm telling you what I think you need to hear if you want to be saved. You cannot be part of that church if you want to be saved.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I still see a difference between individuals falling away and the whole institution being apostate.
Well, the whole institution is apostate. You're just saying you're hoping it's going to get better.
Um, no, I'm not convinced that it is entirely apostate.
Do you think the Russian Orthodox clergy are all apostate?
No,
Do you think Kirill is apostate?
probably. I mean, I find it hard to judge the eternal destiny of any individual, but he seems pretty bad. Yeah, I would grant you that.
Are you sure it's probably?
Um, am I sure? It's probably. That's an interesting
What does
question.
probably mean, Ruben? What is making you say probably instead of yes?
What makes me say probably is that I'm not the judge.
Well, what does Christ mean when he says, "Judge for yourselves. Judge a tree by its fruit"?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um, yeah, I guess it's just that I've read things online about Kirill, but that's about it.
I'll
I
send
don't
you.
know the guy.
I'll send you video. Oh, come on. You don't know the guy. God has worked it out that we all know the guy because we've got the internet. We can all know each other. And he's so evil that he can't hide it. So let's see here.
Yeah,
Kirill
he's I'm
corruption.
not gonna debate you on that. He seems like a real bad guy.
A literal KGB agent. Literal. Do you know what the KGB is?
Yeah.
I mean, good grief! I just how much more evil can anybody be? KGB is a literal murder and torture organization. They take well,
Hmm.
they are spying for the government. They capture people who are suspected of being treasonous to the government and torture them to death. But okay, all right. I can't think of
Yeah.
anything more evil. But I sent you this video.
No.
This is a little summary. This is very important for you to watch.
Mhm.
It's not a maybe. It's a yes, absolutely. And everybody who submits to this man is disobeying the church's teaching that you flee heretical bishops. And the fact that he is in power and that there's no way to depose him means that the church is totally corrupt. Because this has been going on for centuries since the emperors were in power. They considered the emperor to be a part of the clergy. They considered him to be above the clergy because he could actually ordain bishops. He can command them to be ordained or depose them with a command. So they've
Mhm.
added, we're talking here about is Luke and are his brothers destroying ecclesiology? Are they making a fake ecclesiology here? Of course, you can confirm we are not. We don't think that we're bishops. But who is destroying the ecclesiastical order? It's the people who've invited an emperor, a man who cannot even be a Christian, let alone be in a power and authority over the church. They're allowing this emperor to come in and destroy apostolic succession. This man who wouldn't even be accepted as a catechumen in the early church.
Mhm. I find it so interesting that so you still believe apostolic succession is totally required for a valid ordination, but you just don't think it's possible.
If it is, it's going to be miraculously done, maybe by Enoch and Elijah when they come back. But
Sure.
remember, apostolic succession is two things: it's the preservation of the doctrine and the discipline, and
Yep.
it's the
Yep.
ordination. And you have to also remember why God instituted bishops. He did it so that the people would have shepherds to teach them the
Hmm.
truth. It's kind of like it's the question of why did God give us parents? Do you know that Christ is our father and the church is our mother? Why does God
Sure.
give us parents, on earthly parents? Earthly parents take care of us. They watch out for us. They give us good food to eat. What do you think it symbolizes that people today, unlike many generations prior, we're in a unique generation where parents are feeding their children the most unhealthy food, making their children fat and sickly, and are killing their children? We know what eating symbolizes from Scripture and from the fathers. Eating symbolizes learning. The church is supposed to be giving her children good food to eat, but the church, far from taking care of her children and preserving them, is actively killing them. She's committing abortions when she corrupts baptisms and the sacraments. She is poisoning them when she gives them false teaching. And she's committing adultery against her husband when she makes an antichrist and tells the children to submit to a false version of Christ instead of the true one. She's bringing in other lovers into the house, telling the children to obey them. So if the mom and dad's job is to take care of the children, if our mother was given to us by God, both our earthly mother, who he tells us to obey, and our spiritual mother, the church, if she was given to us to save our lives, then if she turns evil, we're supposed to run away from her. It doesn't make any sense to obey the evil mother who's killing us and call that obedience to God if she's telling us to disobey God. If you have a mom that tells you don't obey your father, we're going to leave him, I'm going to divorce him, I'm getting myself a new husband, does God expect you to obey your mother?
Probably not. No.
Of course not. She's failed to serve her purpose as your mother. So God doesn't say you obey them. You never obey an authority that tells you to do something evil. So if the church then is teaching us lies, if they're destroying us, we are the ones preserving apostolic succession. We are the ones that are surviving. We're doing what must be done to survive. Because if you, Ruben, lived in a family where mom was an adulteress and she took you away from dad, and dad, you knew dad was trying to get you, he was trying to save you, but mom was taking you away, you would be required. And if your mom was abusive and neglectful and not taking care of your siblings, what would your responsibility be toward your siblings? Would you say, well, typically mom's supposed to be doing all this stuff. I'm not going to do these things. I'm not going to, bathe my siblings. I'm not going to wash them with the washing that they need. I'm not going to give them food because that's mom's job. You wouldn't do that, would you? You would do the things that mom would have done.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think that's in total agreement with everything that you read about what you do if your priest is heretical slash apostate. I still think there's a difference about the entire institution going astray, just because there's this tension um, where they do clearly talk about a visible church that you're required to be a part of.
Yes, we agree with
Which,
that. We agree with that. We don't contradict that. We know that there was a visible institution that you were required to be a part of, and we do believe there is still a visible institution. But we believe in a visible apostate church. Even you believe in a visible apostate church. Because every Orthodox church believes the vast majority of all Christians are apostates. So they would say the same thing. They'd say, you need to find us, the little remnant, and join us. The Orthodox. By the way, let's be philosophical. I want to ask you a question, Ruben.
yeah,
How do you think? What method has God given us to know for sure that we're choosing the right church? Because of course there's the Catholics, and there's the Sedevacantists, and then with the
yeah,
Orthodox you've got Eastern, then you've got all the Orientals saying the Easterns have fallen into apostasy, and then not until just recently the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was having a huge fight with the Russian Orthodox Church, and then they reconciled, and I don't know, maybe their tensions, they're about to break up again, and Constantinople excommunicated Russia in 2018, and then they got back together. Then you've got the Assyrian Orthodox Church of the East, and you've got, of course, the true Orthodox Church. They believe all of them are off the rails. But what objective method has God given us to know for sure that we're picking the right one, even if there are two options, Russian or Orthodox and the Catholic?
yeah. I think that's a fantastic question. I was actually going to bring up the same thing because I appreciated that you asked that question in your video. Um, it's essentially epistemology, right? Like one of the big questions I'm asking right now is how does God really expect the average Joe to figure this thing out? Because sola scriptura, I think, is pretty obviously stupid. Um, the perspicuity of scripture is just a very silly idea. So what
Agreed.
has God given us to, and really like the average Joe too, like doing all this studying that we're doing is difficult for the average person. And that makes me a lot more sympathetic to the idea that there's actually a visible institution um, for as the means of preserving correct doctrine. It seems to be a lot more friendly to regular people. Um, but to answer your question, how does God expect us to figure out what the right church is? Um, I don't know if I've fully figured that out yet. I mean, it's kind of the question I'm asking in a way. So
And they have to
I
be
know what
sympathetic.
your answer. Your answer is well, read the church fathers, right? But
Not just that,
I've, I've
not just that I'm going to do it though, but that God has commanded us to do it. It's a command in Scripture, and of course, it's a command in the church that whatever is from the beginning and was believed by the whole church has to be true.
mhm, mhm.
And God does give us that method.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's what the Catholics and Orthodox will tell you. Even if you weren't sure, you do know that's what the Catholics and Orthodox say you have to do. They say, go look at history. Like they'll wish that you're a simple-minded person, but if you ask them the logical question, hey, what am I supposed to do? Don't just tell me to roll the dice. I need to know for sure that you, the Orientals, or you, the Catholics, or you, the Russian Orthodox, are the true church. Prove it to me. Then they will always say, well, all the other churches, they've gone off the rails. They've departed from the original faith. And you say, okay, is there a
mhm,
way for me to verify that? And then it's their job to bring forward evidence. So
yeah,
if they do this thing, if they say this thing, well, you gotta rely on us to interpret the church fathers for you, you know that is dishonest. Because if they even have to interpret the church fathers for us, then that means we have to randomly choose one of them to interpret the church fathers for us. Because they would all say that the others are wrong in their interpretation of the church fathers. So there has to be something that is up to us to interpret, right?
yep.
So that's what we're doing. We're doing the very thing that they have commanded us to do. I would assume I can include you in that you are going to look at history and see if their claim is valid. Are they the original church? Have they reversed on doctrines? Or do they really teach the original faith?
For sure. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And we really believe, we really believe God has been gracious by allowing them to reach such a point of depravity that there is no denying it to any honest person who knows anything about church history, or even just has a has a spiritual sense. There's no denying that they are apostate. Have you seen the list of their heresies in the Orthodox Church? This little list right here.
I haven't seen your particular list. No.
Let me read these to you. And if there are any that you're not sure about, then we can skip that. But I think the top 10 here, at least, are just as clear as they could be that these are heresies. Even using common sense. Not even you don't even have to read the church fathers, but we have so many scriptures and so many church fathers unanimously agreeing these are some of the worst sins human beings can commit. But remember we were talking
What's the
about
name of this article so I can move to it on my computer?
what's the what?
The name of this article here.
I just sent it to you. Or wait, let me make sure I sent it to you.
Yeah, there you go. You
Yeah.
sent it. Okay, go ahead.
And each of these will take you to the spots in the dictionary, okay? Now, you were saying, I'm not sure I can prove that we should never use self-defense based on Justin's quotes. But you can
Yeah.
skip that for now. I never start with self-defense when I talk to people about this doctrine. I just say, war is forbidden unanimously by the church. By the way, let me just real quick for you, since you have a minute, let me just show you some quotes at the bottom of this page here, because we have post-Nicene fathers, including Basil. Let me show you something. Athanasius has great quotes like, "What do bishops have to do with war?"
Denying Nephilim. Wild.
Well, it's important. It is a very important doctrine. Every single doctrine, Ruben, connects to other doctrines. There's
Sure.
so you will realize this. Sometimes we're talking about a subject like female modesty. We're talking about a subject like veiling, and then we'll say, well, look, the church fathers say women should veil because of the angels, and this is referring to the event when the angels fell into lust with women. And they'll say,
Mhm.
that never happened. So you see how this connects to the subject of female modesty. So it is an important doctrine. It connects to a lot of things. It even connects to the incarnation. Let's just read this though from Rufinus. Rufinus talks about Julian the Apostate in Book 10 of his church history. He says, now Julian, once he had come into the east to drive out the Persians by war, blah, 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 he says, forbidding Christians access to the study of the pagan authors, he decreed that elementary schools should be open only to those who worship the gods and goddesses. He ordered that posts in the armed or civil service should be given only to those who sacrificed. He decreed that the government of provinces and the administration of justice should not be entrusted to Christians, since their own law forbade them to use the sword. So this is a pagan. I love this when we show things like this to the Catholics and Orthodox, and they say, "Well, Julian the Apostate wasn't a saint," or something ridiculous like that. Don't they understand? Like we'll also show them things like Celsus, saying Christians don't have images or temples, and they'll say, "Well, he's not a saint." Well, obviously he's not a saint. Of course we know Celsus the pagan is not a saint. Or we'll do so many others like Trypho the Jew or something, talking about the practices of Christians, the well-known practices of Christians, that they don't have altars or temples or images, and they'll be like, "Well, he's not a saint." Yeah, that's why this is such a great quote, because you cannot say this is a biased Christian author. This is a pagan who hates Christians. And the reason he hates Christians is because one of the well-known aspects of Christians is etc. And in
Mhm.
this case, you have a completely objective source telling you the Christians' own law forbade them to use the sword. This is one of your best quotes because it is objective. It is not one person's opinion. It is a man who hates Christians with a passion and says, I'm not going to give you a post in the military. You're not even allowed to do that according to your own law. Great quote.
What time did that quote be from?
This is Rufinus in mid 300s.
Mid 300s.
Well, that's when Julian the Apostate.
And yet we know from the 250s that there is senators in the church.
You're talking about Apollonius.
Um,
Or you're talking about
is
a vague quote from Eusebius.
I am talking about the quote from Eusebius.
Please do send me that quote. I'm aware of the quote, but send it to me. If you read the quote and you're sure that that's what it means, because I've read the quote, then go ahead and send it. It does not ever say that Christians ever joined the Senate or that Christians were ever allowed to join the military. But we do know that certain men who were in the Senate or who were in the military became Christians, but they ceased to use the sword after that, Ruben.
Well, if it seems that this person was in the Senate, they were a Christian who was a senator, not somebody that ceased to be a senator.
Right. We have that like with Apollonius, if you're thinking of Apollonius, but you'll have to tell me who you're talking about. We know that there were
Yeah.
people who were senators and became Christians, but they ceased to exercise the office of whatever they were enrolled in, whether the Senate or the military.
See if I can pull this quote up.
That's why John the Baptist told them, "Do violence to no man." He didn't tell them to quit being soldiers altogether, but only that their actions had to change.
Where are we?
If you find it, you can send it to me. But anyway, this is a great quote, whether you can find that quote or not. See, we harmonize everything they say, Ruben. Other people really love to find contradictions in the church fathers. But we find so many things that people think are a contradiction. It turns out there is no contradiction. They have the same mindset as people who try to find contradictions in the Bible. Anybody can find verbal contradictions in the Bible, but is that an honest and obedient attitude to have toward God or toward the church? To be looking for contradictions in the church fathers?
Um, yeah, I think that's fine. Actually, you should definitely test your presuppositions and seek to find contradicting data. I think that's very good.
That's not good. That's not an honest attitude to have. If you're looking for
I
contradictions,
agree.
and what you should be seeking is to find reconciliation, a resolution to a supposed contradiction. That's what we do. And we find the resolutions to contradictions.
I think you should let the data speak for itself.
But sometimes there's something that's specific or it's an exceptional circumstance. Don't you know that people tend to take exceptions as the rule very frequently, and they use an exceptional piece of evidence to try to prove something as a rule?
Mm-hmm.
Well, people are doing that with war here. They have hundreds of quotes from the church fathers saying we don't go to war. They have objective quotes. They have quotes from objective sources, even the pagans saying this is against the law. And then they'll try to use one little exceptional circumstance, which doesn't even disprove what we're saying.
Sure, sure.
Here is Asterius. Asterius also is commemorated on account of his pious boldness in connection with this affair. He was a Roman of senatorial rank and in favor with the emperors, and well known to all on account of his noble birth and wealth. Being present at the martyr's death, he took the body away on his shoulder and arraying him in a splendid and costly garment. Yes, this is very similar to Apollonius. We know that there were persons who were already senators when they converted to Christianity.
Here's the preceding parts of that. Um, it's actually a soldier and a senator. So there was a soldier who was martyred, and then this senator took his body, and this is like 250-ish.
I see.
Marinus.
Who wrote this?
Marinus. Yeah, this is Eusebius.
He says, at that time, when the peace of the churches had been everywhere restored, Marinus in Caesarea in Palestine, who was honored for his military deeds and illustrious by virtue of family and wealth, was beheaded for his testimony to Christ on the following account. Well, does it say that he was honored for his military deeds by the church or by the government?
It doesn't. It doesn't say.
Well, since it's totally ambiguous, we have to assume it is not by the church. The church never honored people for military deeds.
We don't have to assume. Actually, if we don't know, then I don't think it's reasonable to assume either
Well,
way.
let's see. If we have 100 church fathers saying Christians are not allowed to fight in the military, and then we have one quote saying that very vaguely that some soldier was honored for his military deeds, and it doesn't mention who he was honored by, why would we assume that the church would honor him for his military deeds?
Yeah, you're right. If that's the contrast of data, I think you'd be correct.
Okay, well, very good. I will take this quote here that I'm showing you, where they say Julian the Apostate, with his government, said Christians should not be allowed to be in the armed forces because their own law forbids them to use the sword, as a powerful testimony that it was forbidden for all Christians to fight in the military. The fact that they continue to excommunicate people for doing it, that they even to this day excommunicate anybody who kills, even in self-defense in the Orthodox Church, proves that this was from the beginning something that was forbidden to
What?
Christians, but that they've become more lax over time.
You're saying the Orthodox Church today excommunicates people for killing in war?
Even in self-defense, yes, they do that all over. I don't know if they do in Russia, because in Russia,
Wait, that's very surprising to hear.
yeah, I've spoken. I have a recorded call speaking with a deacon about this, and he was talking about it. He was saying it. Yeah, he knows that is a contradiction. And he became a nihilist in the middle of our conversation, just saying, well, look, if the Orthodox Church isn't it, you don't want to know what I'm going to do. He said, you just don't even want to know what I'm going to do if it turns out the Orthodox Church isn't it. Yeah. Anyway, so I think you should look into each doctrine then. You should start with the worst of all the doctrines like we have here. You should investigate what the church teaches about that. If they have a unanimous teaching, and if we can prove that the church gradually became lax, not at just some random time period, but, well, at a very predictable time period, when it became joined with the government. Wow. What a surprise that when the church becomes joined with the government and is being ruled by an emperor, suddenly they start endorsing going to war or justifying it. Wow, what a surprise. Nobody could have seen that coming. They're like, prove that the church changed after the Council of Nicaea. An emperor is ruling over the church. You don't see that as a massive change in the church? I'm like, well, prove that the church changed after the Council of Nicaea. And then they say, and by the way, the only way you can have an ecumenical council is if it's convened by the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. Wait, what? And I got to prove that the church changed after the Council of Nicaea? So there's war, but let's go on to the next one. No doubt you've seen Berceau and others talk about divorce and remarriage.
Yep.
This is a huge one. Idolatry, the worst of all their sins. And you should see what the church fathers say about this. Have you clicked this article on our website?
No, I haven't.
Well, it's kind of big. Here, look how big it is. You know, Berceau and all of his friends have completely failed to refute this heresy because there are more post-Nicene church fathers, literally all of them, totally refuting this false doctrine. There are more post-Nicene fathers doing it than pre-Nicene.
Mm-hmm. You've talked to my buddy Jonathan, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I have our calls recorded. Let me tell you how the call goes. It goes like this. Well, Luke, Eusebius says that some people were venerating an image. And Eusebius says that they're pagans, Jonathan. Oh, Eusebius was a heretic. I'm telling you, that's verbatim how this conversation went. And he says, well, what about the Ark of the Covenant? You know, what about bowing to the Ark of the Covenant? What do you think about that, Ruben? Has anybody refuted that ridiculous charge that Joshua was bowing to the Ark of the Covenant?
I guess what's commonly said is that he's bowing to God, not the Ark.
Well, let's think about this here. They make it sound like the Ark of the Covenant is similar to an icon and that it was meant to be venerated. But did God ever tell the Israelites to bow down to the Ark of the Covenant? Ever in Israel's history? Did he ever even let the Israelites see the Ark of the Covenant? Ever?
Yeah, it was moved a few times. People definitely saw it.
Could they see it, though? They were never allowed to see it. It was veiled at all times. If somebody could see it, it was against God's law. God commanded that it always be veiled. There was one person in Israel who was allowed to see the ark one time a year. And God said that one time a year, when they would see the Ark of the Covenant, that he says, I will appear above the mercy seat between the cherubim. I'll be above it. And they want to make it sound like they're actually venerating the Ark of the Covenant when they bow before it, when God himself is appearing there. They would say, we're not venerating you, God. We're actually venerating your ark. You're kind of just getting in the way. Could you move, please? We're trying to venerate this thing, and you're just standing there, right between the cherubim. I mean, that is ridiculous, to suggest that they are bowing to anything other than God himself. God never commanded them to bow down to images. In fact, as the church fathers like Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria point out, the Ark of the Covenant and the angels on top of it discourage any kind of worship being paid to them. Why? Because they themselves are bowing. Are they bowing to each other? God said to depict them as bowing. Are they bowing to each other? Are the angels worshiping each other? No, they are directing your worship to the person between them, the person who appears between them. So they are making it impossible to bow to them, because who would ever bow to a person who's bowing to someone else? Would you bow to a bowing person? That makes no sense. They're telling you to bow to somebody else. So in every way, God designed these things to not be objects of veneration. He even specifically said that not only is it to be veiled at all times except one time of the year, but that even the angels themselves are to be overshadowing themselves with their wings. And this means that their bodies are actually covered with their wings, because that is how God has described the angels in heaven, that they are always veiling themselves in God's presence with their wings. So, in more ways than I could even count, God has discouraged veneration of the Ark of the Covenant. And they suggest, using the Masoretic text, not the Septuagint, that Joshua is bowing to it. You know that in the Septuagint it just says, "And Joshua bowed in the presence of the Lord," and the Masoretic says, "And he bowed before the Ark of the Covenant." But even if they weren't using the corrupt Masoretic text, which is so hypocritical of them, the so-called preservers of the Septuagint, they're appealing to this corrupt text from the Jews who are truly carnally minded and venerators of objects. Even if it were true, we still should not think that Joshua is bowing to the ark, but bowing to God, who was accustomed to appear before them. But nobody ever bowed to the ark, ever.
Mhm. Do you think having images in church of biblical figures is bad?
Well, before I answer that, I want you to know that I agree with the church's unanimous opinion on this. We have 57 people here, 50 of them before even the year 500, even before the year 400 for most of them. And it's every single person you could think of. Rousseau's list is absolutely pathetic. That list of quotes that's been circulating in Anabaptist groups is just pathetic. It's all the church fathers. Every single church father you can think of says, we are forbidden to bow down to a lifeless object, to a lifeless image. We cannot bow down to it. God forbade two things: proskuneo, that's bowing, and latreia, which is offering sacrifices or incense. And incense actually is a sacrifice, according to the scriptures and the church's definition. Incense is a sacrifice. We are forbidden to bow or offer sacrifice of incense to an image. And the Orthodox do both. They make sure to do both. They make sure to make it a law to do both. And as for your question of whether it's okay to just have an image, the church never talks about such a thing. Just having an image cannot be an evil thing. But the idea that you're honoring Christ by making a picture of his servile form, that body, that is blasphemy. That is only pushed by the most ignorant people, that Jesus would be honored that way. It was dishonoring to him and humiliating for him to take on a human body. And Jesus doesn't look like that anymore. Jesus showed the apostles what he looks like now. He gave them a little sneak peek of it. Do you remember when he did that?
Um, yeah, I guess in the 40 days after his resurrection.
Well, in the Transfiguration, actually, he it
Mm.
says his face was white as light, and his garments were as white as snow, and they couldn't even bear to look at him. And it says nobody can. Moses couldn't look at him and live. It's so bright. It's as bright as the sun, and no human being can look at that. The church fathers say that when Jesus was resurrected, he continued to be incognito. He continued to keep himself covered by a body, by having skin on the outside of his body, whereas that is not what his body really looks like. He was just turning off the lights. And if anybody
Mhm.
thinks that that is Jesus' body or it's our body, that's what it's going to look like, they are completely mistaken. So they have a choice between either depicting his servile form, which was humiliating for him to wear and which he does not have anymore, or they can depict light. They could just try to draw light. And, Eusebius and all the others laugh at anybody who would try to do that, just drawing pure light. So we don't think we're honoring Christ by making pictures of him. Somebody can make a picture, like we did in our video about how ugly Christ was when he came, just how epic his first coming was, that he was totally veiling his true divinity in an ugly, sickly form, as so many church fathers say, as a test to see who would believe in him, who would believe in his words and his actions, who could look past the very humble and ugly outer appearance of his body, and who would believe that there was divinity hiding in there. Who could pass the test? You could draw a picture of that and give glory to him and say what a humble man he is, what a magnificent God he is for doing that. But you're not actually honoring him by bowing to that body and saying, "This is my God." Like Peter here says, he points to this body, which that doesn't even exist anymore, that look of his body. It's completely swallowed up in immortality. And Peter here is like, "Look at this face." The Orthodox say, "Look at that face. That's the face you're going to be worshiping." Not me. I'm going to be worshiping a God that I see with my mind. I'm going to be worshiping a God who is sharing his glory with me. And I'm not going to be looking at flesh and blood like that anymore.
We should set up a call with you, me, and Jonathan sometime. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, so I didn't get to go very far with Jonathan because he kept jumping to a different quote. Do you You've heard certainly the quote about Eusebius and the statue, right?
Yeah.
Let's see what he says. He says a brazen statue. He
Yeah,
says
he definitely like it.
who what?
Eusebius doesn't like the statue, right?
Okay, if you accept that then, and you've read his letter to Constantia,
I don't think I have.
you want me to read it to you? It's just this little. It's just these paragraphs. Well, actually, it's a little shorter than that. It's just this. You want me to read this to you?
You don't have to. I'll check it out later.
He is absolutely against honoring Christ by making pictures of him, and all of them are. Every single church father,
Mhm. Yeah.
every
Yeah.
single church father without exception. Augustine talks about the idea of, they all talk about the anthropomorphites. Have you ever, the anthropomorphite heresy?
No.
Well, it's just the idea of worshiping God in a physical form when you pray to Him. And this is an untapped quote mine pool for Berceau and anybody else. Of course, Berceau is a heretic, so he can't defeat the heretics. He doesn't submit to the church father. But look, it's one of your greatest resources, these different subjects, such as the image of God. That's a great one. Every time the church fathers define the image of God, they say it's incorporeal. You can't see it, you can't touch it. That refutes the Catholics when they say that an icon, just a picture, is the image of God. Because it's not. Your soul is the image of God, not your body. But then another one would be anthropomorphites. People who want to imagine a physical form when they pray to God. The church fathers all say, post-Nicene and pre-Nicene, they say these are the most superstitious, foolish people. If you want to pray while looking at a physical form, they all say, do you see how that could relate to icons? They say we don't look
Yes.
at physical forms when we, like, you should see John Cassian just absolutely destroying those people, and Augustine and all the others. Here's Augustine. He says, you need not rate too high the privilege of seeing that servile form. So he's even talking about seeing it alive, let alone seeing just a picture of it. He says, his friends saw it, and his foes saw it. Some who saw it slew him. Others who did not see it have believed. Here in his humble lifetime, his servant form was seen by the good and the wicked. And on Judgment Day, too, both good and wicked will see it. So he's saying they're going to see that servile form. But then he points out, Jesus said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And he says, what does that insinuate except that they haven't seen God if they've seen his servile form? That is not God. That is a veil. That's clothing over his divinity that hides it. Just like Paul says in Hebrews, that Christ entered the Holy of Holies through the veil, that is, his flesh. So Christ was wearing a veil when he came to earth. That's what Samson's long hair symbolizes, a veil, covering himself up, making him look like a woman, making him weak when he's actually strong. So Christ showing you his body is not a privilege, he is saying. It's a test. You, Ruben, and I would have been tested if we had seen his body because it would make it harder to believe in him. That's what the Catholics don't understand. There's so much they don't understand. He says, that which the Lord promised, I will show myself to them. What does that word myself point to? Not the form of a servant. What is myself then? The form of God. So that's what we're looking forward to. I don't rate highly the privilege of seeing that servile form.
Interesting. Yeah, it's not really an argument I've ever thought of before.
Yes, for so everything corporeal is rejected. They all say, we're not living for corporeal things. Have you seen Hilary?
No.
Let me just show you a few quotes from Hilary. He says, some, however, some pagans in the past, they worshipped those corporeal and visible forms of created things themselves in the elements of earth and heaven. So again, our argument, just to refresh you in case you didn't understand, we don't bow down to images or offer incense to images because God does not wish to be worshipped under the form of stones and wood, as Ambrose says. If God wanted to be worshipped under the form of wood and stones, he would have told us. He would have said, I want you guys to make an image. I want you to bow down to that thing, and that will stand in for me. None of the church fathers say that. They all condemn that. Anyway, he says, some people worship corporeal and visible forms of created things themselves in the elements of earth and heaven. Lastly, certain individuals place their gods in the images of man, animals, beasts, and serpents, and confined the God of the universe and the author of infinity within the narrow limits of metals, stones, and genealogies. And it was no longer fitting that they who clung to such ridiculous, degrading, and irreligious theories should be the teachers of the truth, when these men themselves were not in agreement about the principles of their most idiotic beliefs. In God, however, nothing was to be worshipped except what was eternal and omnipotent. They go on to say how they only worship God with their mind. That is the eye that we see God with. He says, desist, O groundless fear of the heretics. And do not lie as if you wish to protect the faith of the church by falsely pretending that you are over solicitous about this statement. So he's writing a book on the Trinity against the people who are denying Christ's divinity. And of course, they always say, you're taking away from God if you worship God's image. He says, according to our explanation, there's nothing corporeal, nothing lifeless in the things of God. What is God is holy God. In him there's nothing but power, life, light, blessedness, and spirit. His nature is incompatible with the dull elements of matter. It was not the carnal body which he had received by birth from the Virgin that could manifest to them the image and likeness of God. Read this statement one more time. It was not the carnal body which he had received by birth from the Virgin that could manifest to them the image and likeness of God. The human aspect which he wore could be no aid towards the mental vision of the incorporeal God. It can be no aid? Not even an aid? Is that what the Catholics teach?
I'm not quite sure if it's the same concept.
Th- They say that God is observed through Christ being manifest. You actually see God. But no church
Well,
father
you
says you can
got the Son.
right, see God. Christ is the Son. He is God. The Son is God.
Mhm. Yeah, amen.
So they would say you see God by seeing Christ's body, and you see Christ's body by seeing the images of his body that somebody imagined. And he's saying that is no aid towards the mental vision of the incorporeal God.
Well, and the incorporeal God would be the Father, right? The Father is not corporeal, but
Neither
the
is
Son.
Christ. Christ was incorporeal before he became incarnate, wasn't he?
Wait, hold on. So you don't think even now, you think now Christ no
No,
longer has a
I
body?
didn't say that. I said before he became incarnate. Was Christ incorporeal before he became incarnate?
I I don't know.
What? Ruben, Jesus, the Son, is a spirit. He is not corporeal before
Or
he was
yeah,
incarnate.
he was not corporeal because he became incarnate, and that was when he became corporeal.
Exactly, exactly. Now he has a body. He has a spiritual body, a median, a mixture of body and spirit. It's called a
Yeah,
spiritual body.
amen. So he is still corporeal.
He's become corporeal, but he was not corporeal before that. He's saying Jesus' body, the human aspect which he wore, could be no aid towards the mental vision of the incorporeal God.
So who's the incorporeal God?
Both Christ and the Father are both incorporeal, were incorporeal,
Or
and their
perhaps
and
it's
their
Father.
and their true essence has always been and always will be incorporeal. But Christ has a body which he uses as an avatar, which is seen by corporeal beings. But that's not his true essence. He's
Sure.
everywhere all at once. That body can only be one place at once. But Jesus is everywhere at once in the entire universe and outside of it. He doesn't
Mm-hmm.
see out of those eyeballs. There aren't even any eyeballs like that anymore on that body. It's pure light, according to every single church father. He says other images made of metals or colors or other materials by various arts reproduce the appearance of the objects which they represent, yet can lifeless copies be put on a level with their living originals, painted or carved or molten effigies with the nature which they imitate? The Son is not the image of the Father after such a fashion as this. He is the living image of the living. You have heard the Catholics say that their icons are the image of God, right?
The Son.
Yes, the image of God, the image of God the Son.
Mm-hmm.
But are those paintings the image of God?
I guess it would depend on your definition of the image of God.
It would depend on if you accept the definition of the image of God, which we have an entire section on in the dictionary. If you look up image of God, endless
Mm-hmm.
quotes from every church father saying the image of God is spiritual. It has nothing to do with any visual. The only reason why God uses that as an analogy is because human beings will understand it. It's not because
Mm-hmm.
Christ is a literal physical image after the Father. Jesus was the image of the Father before he ever even became incarnate. So if he was the image of the Father before he became incarnate, the image of God is not corporeal. To be the
Mm-hmm.
image of God just means he is a duplicate. It says he is the exact image and the exact representation of his nature. And Paul elsewhere says he is the image of the invisible God. Well, there you go. He's invisible. So if he's the image, if he's the duplicate of the invisible God, and God is invisible, well, that means this image is not visible. Remember, that carnal body can be no aid in the. What's he? Here, let's hear him say it one more time. No aid. He says, carnal body, which you received from the Virgin. The human aspect which you were could be no aid towards the mental vision of the incorporeal God. This is what they all say. And what is John of Damascus, the chief idol maker? What does he say? He says, if the image of a king is the king, then the image of Christ is Christ. It is Jesus. It is God. The image is God. Outrageous. So easy to refute, using hundreds and hundreds, really thousands, if you go through this whole list. This isn't a David Berceau list.
All right. Well, hey, this has been a good talk.
Here, let me show you one more, and then you can go. One more. Hillary, hey, look, he just keeps going. He says, I ask whether there is a visible image of the invisible God, and whether the infinite God can be brought together in an image so that he's visible through the image of a visible form, or of a limited form. He says, I ask whether that can even be possible. And that's exactly what the Catholics teach. This is Hilary of Poitiers, the chief defender of the Trinity, apart from Athanasius, during the Arian crisis. He's saying it's not
What are you
possible.
criticizing in this discourse? Do you
Whether
think he's directly addressing icons, or is he talking about something else?
Well, it applies to icons. God worked that out. All of it applies it. Of course, icons didn't exist. The idea
Well,
of
I think it's a valid question to ask. Like, what is he talking about?
right, what he is talking about is the Eunomian idea, the Arian idea that God cannot have an image of himself that's fully divine. And Hilary is saying he's nothing like images. This is not idolatry, because that's what they would call it, idolatry. He's saying this is nothing like that. Jesus is the living image of the Father. And he's saying Jesus is not a visible image like that. The way that he is the image of the Father is in a completely incorporeal sense. And he says there is no visible image of the Father. And he's saying the finite God can't even be brought together in an image that's visible. This is totally contrary to what the Catholics teach. They believe Jesus' physical body is the image of God. A flagrant heresy. And they think God wants to be worshipped through images when he has expressly forbidden it, on the ground that it is not alive. We do not bow down to something that's not alive. The church fathers all say you would get away with bowing down to a living animal before you got away with bowing down to a dead image. Because to bow down is to say that it is superior to you. When you bow down to something, you're saying, I'm your servant.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, bowing down to a king in a non-worshipful way would not be permitted, according to you?
No, bowing down to king in every circumstance is allowed. Bowing down to any human being, because they are made in the image of God. You can bow down to as many human beings as you want. All the church fathers say that. Scriptures say that. And the
Do you
church,
know how the Jews bow as a greeting? Is that okay?
right? That's what I'm saying. You can bow down to human beings; they're alive. But you can't bow down to a
Oh,
dead image.
okay, gotcha, gotcha.
You see, and you're saying in a worshipful way. These are terms that have been given, like they're ambiguous and they're circular and they don't even mean anything. Like, don't bow down in any worshipful way. Bowing down is worship. In fact, that word for bow is usually translated as worship. You can worship a human being if it just means bowing, but you can't offer sacrifices to a human being. You can bow down, and what do they do? You're fully aware of it, Ruben. When the Catholics are trying to convince you to bow down to dead images, what do they use as proof? They use people bowing down to living human beings as proof that you can bow down to dead images. Isn't that deceptive?
I don't. That's not usually the argument, but
It is. It's the main
I
argument. They
guess
say
I,
it is. It's their main argument. They say, look, Abraham bowed down to the sons of Heth. The children of Israel bowed down to David. They're always pointing down to bowing down to living people. And then if that doesn't work, they'll try the Ark of the Covenant nonsense. And nobody who's read the Fathers can fall for that. Yep, we
Yeah.
can bow
All right.
down
Hey, we'll
living
probably
people.
wrap it up.
All right, call me again, Ruben. Think about the things we've said, especially the subject of what the image of God is, and whether this is all the only thing you can ask. Just this is the most important question: where in the early church's history did it ask us or command us to bow down to images of God, and where do they say that God wants to be honored through dead images? That's what you should contemplate.
All right, man. Appreciate the time. Good talk.
Yes. Farewell. I hope you'll call again.
All right. See ya.